everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the UnHerd Club. Thank you for all fitting in this quite small room, too small in fact for all of the wonderful people who wanted to come tonight. So you are the lucky people who managed to acquire tickets. This has been one of our most popular events to date, actually. So thank you for making it here to be with us tonight. Very often at the end of an evening, usually a Saturday evening, I will find that the conversation turns to how dire the situation seems to be in the world right now. At the conclusion of that conversation, many people around me will get up from the table and say, "See you at church tomorrow," at which point I suddenly feel a little out of place because I won't see them at church tomorrow. But surely there has been some sort of resurgence, you could say, of Christian feeling in this country, at least certainly in the US. Just this week, a study from Pew Research found that the number of people identifying as Christians is no longer declining in the US, so it is back on the up. A rise amongst Christians comes primarily from adults born in the 1980s, otherwise known as geriatric millennials, and people born between 2000 and 2005, so that's older Gen Z. So maybe that explains why I have not quite caught on, because I am neither of those. But there does seem to be something in the air. I must admit, though, it does fill me with a little bit of worry. I sometimes find myself feeling the way I used to when I would hang out with a lot of hardcore militant atheists. I start to think, oh no, is that a herd I sense? And of course, being who I am and where I work, that to me gives me the shivers. So it's something that we wanted to talk about tonight. And we want to answer what seems like perhaps a simple question, but I think will prove to be a much more complex one. Could this kind of faith, the faith that we're seeing resurge across the West, solve what one of our guests here defines as the meaning crisis, which is that kind of feeling of ennui that often sets in on a Saturday night? Our two guests this evening who have bravely come to chip at the coalface of this very issue are the wonderful Elizabeth Oldfield to my left, the host of the Sacred podcast, which I would thoroughly recommend to you all, and author of a brilliant book, Fully Alive. And next to her, John Vervaeke, who has been here over a year ago,
yes,
and who I had a wonderful, long and incredibly dense conversation about zombies with in front of maybe some of you, who's a professor of psychology and cognitive science and the psychology of Buddhism at the University of Toronto, and also the author of a brilliant new book, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which lays out the origins of this so-called meaning crisis. So, to get us started and to also avoid us getting into a kind of quagmire of ideas and data and sloughing through kind of philosophies that we might only half understand, I want to be almost embarrassingly simplistic about the whole thing and just start with the basics, the definitions of these words we're talking about tonight. And that, firstly, I suppose, has to be the idea of faith. So I'm going to ask both of our guests what their relationship is to faith. Do they have faith, and what does faith mean to them? Elizabeth, I think probably you're the obvious person to start with.
Just a small one there.
Yeah, easy.
So, as you say, there are complex and simple ways to answer that. But perhaps the easiest way is to say that I am a Christian. And by that I mean I really want to take Jesus seriously. This enigmatic, confronting, complex figure that we find in my scriptures in the New Testament. And the reason that I'm a Christian, I guess my conscious reason that I'm a Christian, as far as we are knowable to ourselves, is that when I was a teenager, I had a very powerful, ecstatic encounter. I prayed, God, if you're there, would you show me? And I felt extremely shown. Then I tried to become an atheist a few years later. And was very, very bad at it. And have circled back to this relationship, this story, this set of practices, this heart of something, someone that I can't seem to shake off. So when we talk about religion, I have complicated feelings about that word. Even when we talk about faith, I have complicated feelings about that word. I prefer the word trust, because I would say what I have is trust. And it's trust in a capital L, love, a person. So I will always want to be bringing everything back to relationality and connection, which is very, very central for how I think about these things.
Mm-hmm. John, your experience of faith in this context is maybe slightly more complex. Tell me, you grew up in a religious household, didn't you?
Very fundamentalist Christian, not only in the nuclear family, extended family, very, looking back on it, very sort of traumatizing form of Christianity that took me quite a bit of therapy, philosophical work, scientific endeavor to properly, at least I hope, process and deal with, yes.
Earlier, before we came down here, you described Elizabeth as a theist and yourself as a non-theist,
yes.
as distinct from an atheist, I assume.
Right. That's right.
So what is that distinction?
Well, I want to first advertise for that. I want to campaign against atheists treating the term non-theist as a synonym. It's not, because there's a needed category in between. A non-theist is somebody who thinks that the notion that there's something we could call sacredness, there's a kind of something that's ultimately real, ultimately orienting, ultimately transforming, that human beings can enter into a proper and intimate relationship. That makes sense, but the non-theist would say that both the theist and the atheist agree that that sacredness should be understood in terms of something like a person with a mind, an entity, a super subject. And of course, I'm not saying that all Christians hold that or anything like that. I'm just talking about standard uses of these terms. I'm very well aware of the Christian mystical tradition. So what I might call common theism, that idea. And the atheists and the Christians, at least in the public domain, seem to agree on that definition. That's what we mean if we're talking about the sacred. And the sacred is a supernatural subject person. And the theist says, yep, and it exists. And the atheist says, yes, that's what it means, and no, there's no such thing as a supernatural super subject person. And the non-theist says that framing is mistaking the nature of sacredness in a fundamental way. And so you get non-theistic religions like Buddhism or Taoism, Advaita Vedanta, that are, I think, to say they're not religious is ridiculous, but to say that they're theistic, I think, is deeply mistaken.
Would non-theism make room for faith then?
Yes, very much. I mean, I want to pick up on what Elizabeth said about trust, but I'll play a little bit of etymology here. Trust and truth and troth, like in betrothal, have a common origin. And so I tend to think of faith, I don't tend to use that word because since the European Enlightenment, we have reduced faith to belief. We even use it as a synonym. What's your belief? I don't think faith is largely a matter of belief. So I prefer the term faithfulness, where it has all those aspects. So I have my beloved partner, Sarah. I am true to her. That's part of being faithful. I am trothed to her. I am bound to her. I have opened myself up so she can grow through me, and she has opened herself up in a reciprocating fashion. And so there's trust there. There's the sense that I have found that there are truths about her that are disclosed to me only if I'm willing to undergo transformation. I just can't sit back neutrally and get those truths. This is a Cartesian dream that I think we have to abandon. There are a lot of truths that are only accessible to us if we're willing to undergo significant transformation. Mm-hmm. So if you put all those together, that kind of trust that commits you to transformation, that coupling with somebody, the trothing, and the being true to them, that's what I think of as faith.
I think I would share some of my hesitancy around the word faith is the way it becomes associated with believing something without any evidence. And I think I was reminded recently that one of the roots of belief is this what Old English leaf, which meant love, leaf Lord, my dear Lord, and therefore even believe feels closer to me. It feels like the word faith needs resting for a while until it can be stripped of those unhelpful associations. Mm-hmm.
Though, of course, in this context, we're talking about the use of faith to battle against this thing called the meaning crisis, which we'll get onto. In the case of Christians, and Elizabeth, you can correct me here, a certain degree of faith in the story of Christianity is necessary there, though surely. And this is where perhaps we might find that there are differences between the two of you.
Sure.
There are questions of the resurrection, the virgin birth. These are very fundamental elements of faith to a narrative of what happened to Jesus when he came to earth that are required to a Christian, but not required, of course, to a Buddhist or indeed someone who perhaps thinks of themselves as more spiritual than they are religious, though you may take umbrage with that way of saying it. So why there do you feel that there isn't as much difference as we think? Because to me, that feels like a very obvious, distinct, and quite, I suppose, limiting difference between yours and John's positions on faith.
Do I think these things are required? I think, again, you're playing into some, and Protestantism has been really responsible for this, some understandings of what, and I think we should probably always be talking about Christianities, right? That no one has a claim that their version is the version, much as it would be nice. The way I think about things that, like you said, the resurrection, the virgin birth, the central stories, these 4 different testimonies of this remarkable life. What do we do with these books, these texts? And for me, it's less about, okay, can I tick these 5 boxes? That makes me a Christian. For me, it started with meeting someone and then go, whoa, what was that? Like, there are these people who sound like maybe they've encountered something similar. What do they think it is? You know, becoming part of storytelling communities, ritual communities, encountering this text. For me, it's much more an orientation towards. And so I want to dwell in these stories. I want every Easter Sunday to contemplate the resurrection. But it is contemplation. It is collective attention turning to the things we want to be formed by. Like, I think Jesus really lived and died and rose again. But I don't, my belief that is an orientation towards relationship rather than a kind of analytic intellectual assent.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It is because when I am turned towards and letting myself be formed by that story, I am more fully human. Mm-hmm. And the accretion of relational and experiential evidence is over time. There's no kind of like prior tick list of assent. It's really, that's what repent means. It means turn towards.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate this kind of openness as well, because you're opening out to other people, John and I included, but John, you are a scientist as well, as someone who writes about these kind of more esoteric philosophical matters. What's it like to be in a scientific community with the degree of faith that you have? And would your scientific colleagues and friends take issue with Elizabeth's idea of this opening out of the story of Jesus Christ, when in fact the facts of the matter require a huge degree of faith?
Okay, that's a really complex question. So for a very long time, my scientific colleagues didn't know what to make of me. I sort of found myself between 2 worlds. I was neither at home in sort of institutionalized legacy religions, and the scientific community wasn't that interested in what I talked about. And so I I'd sort of developed a reputation of going into areas that the scientific community had called woo, and I would go in and find actual good cognitive science there and bring it out. And I've done that now for, 30 years, and so I'm now sort of, John's sort of the wonderful weird person in the community. We like John.
The woo wrangler is what's
like
coming into my head.
Acceptable face of woo.
Yeah, well, I was one of the first people at the University of Toronto to talk scientifically about mindfulness. I've submitted a paper on a naturalistic account of qi rather than any kind of woo. I talk a lot about mystical experiences, transformative.
But when you speak about that, when you talk about the science of qi,
yep.
Is that coming from a place that requires faith in qi, or is that actually what your scientific colleagues would recognize as rational science? Do you see what I'm getting at here? Is there some degree to these topics that requires an element of faith?
I'm worried that there's a bunch of things being sort of smushed together that the Enlightenment said we should smush together that I don't want to smush together.
Yeah. Go on, so pick those apart.
Thank you. So, we were given this hard and fast distinction between facts and values. Science talks about the facts, and then there's this mushy stuff over here where people have subjective values. That whole dichotomy has absolutely collapsed, and it's very easy to see why it collapsed if you want to go into the argument at some point. And then the idea that to be rational is to be committed to a certain specific sort of reductive metaphysics. Many people in the scientific and even within analytic philosophy, that has been largely rejected. So I want to pull things apart, and I want to make space for something in between, and how I would orient, and I share Elizabeth's idea that orientation is more important than belief, and we can talk about what orientation means. But there's a category that falls between what we regard as fiction and what we regard as fact. And what's really interesting is this category is something I'm exploring now. And I'll point out this category to you and how it's at the core of your rationality. So you being rational requires you to be able to look on your own mind, reflect on it, intervene in it, yes? So when I ask you what you're thinking right now, you can do that, can you not?
Sometimes, yeah. Well, depends what sort of mood I'm in.
Well, the degree, however reliably you can do it is how reliably you can be rational. Will you give me that?
Yes, yeah. I'm not the most rational person.
Okay, so that space in your head, is it a literal space?
No.
Is it merely fictional, or does it give you actual knowledge?
No, it gives me actual knowledge.
So what is it? It's neither factual nor fictional, and yet rationality depends on it. What is that space? So the term used there is not imaginary, but imaginal. It's an imaginal. You're not looking at an image. You're looking through it into a reality, and you don't have any access to that reality except through that image. If I say, I want you to look at your mind, but don't look through that inner space, you have no way of doing that. And there's a lot of these things that I think religion talks about that should be understood imaginally. We don't look at them. They're not idols, they're icons we look through imaginally because they orient us to something that we otherwise can't get access to.
So a bit of faith in the literal telling of the events in the Bible is not required then, in your understanding, to come to truth. Would that be the follow?
Yeah, and I wonder, even that distinction we have about like the idea that the Bible should be read primarily literally is a modern invention. It's invented in the United States. The fundamentalist movement is a reaction to the progress of science in American society. And if you go before the Enlightenment, the idea, like if you look at the beginnings, like Origen, it's not Origin, but the guy Origen, right? He thought that people who were reading the Bible literally were reducing and insulting God. Of course, God can't have a hand, and he doesn't have eyes, and he can't hear because he's not a body. And so from the very beginning, Christians have taken an attitude that, no, you're not supposed to ignore these things. His view was they're imaginal. They give you a way of relating, right? Like you do to that inner space in yourself, or you have an imaginal relationship to your future self. You're constantly concerned in taking care of your future self, but that future self isn't a fact, but it's not a fiction either, and yet it's crucial to you having a constant relationship to it. And people who don't take up a reliable relationship to their future self, think of the faith there, if they're not faithful to their future self, they show all kinds of cognitive deficits.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we've got this kind of concept that seems to be at least partially shared between the two of you, of faithfulness being useful. How do we use that to deal or not with the meaning crisis? We need to work out what this meaning crisis is. John's written a whole book about it and taught courses about it and done hundreds of hours of YouTube videos about it. Because of that, I'm going to ask Elizabeth first.
Oh no!
Because then you don't get to copy whatever John says. Elizabeth, is there a meaning crisis? Feel free to say no. If so, what caused it?
I think there is a hunger. What we have is a collective hungering for more. And it's hard to tell if we've always had it, or if there is a unique acuteness in this moment. My obsession is about the faulty anthropology that individualism gives us. And so John's work finds this all over the many disciplines that you're aware of. In kind of my heart language, we talk about a Trinitarian anthropology, that human beings are made in the image of divine love, that before anything else exists is relationship. That love is prior, that relationship is prior. Ian McGilchrist talks about relationship precedes relata. That this religio, this connection, this between is like the fundamental fact of the universe. And therefore we are made, I believe, by God and for God, by each other and for each other. And what an individualistic understanding of the human does is it fractures that. We pull back into ourselves and we try and create ourselves and we liberate ourselves from constraint, from responsibility, from interdependence, from need, from vulnerability. And in so doing, we make ourselves less fully human. Mm-hmm. And that, you could look back in history and go, it began here, or it began here, or it began here. Like there's been a consistent intensifying. The Reformation is part of it, the Enlightenment is part of it. Where we are right now with the information age is it on steroids. So whether we are in a unique moment of that or not, probably not, but I feel that the loneliness of the human condition, part of what's driving that is this fracturing of vertical and horizontal relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's when you say the word meaning crisis or hear the phrase meaning crisis, that's kind of my set of associations with it. But it
very much, I think, aligns with a lot of what John writes about. But I think perhaps maybe where we can dig deeper here, and John, you can help us, is what is the specificity of this meaning crisis? Because Elizabeth's right, of course, humanity goes through cycles of crises and redemption, and over again it happens. But you write specifically about the exact moment that we're in now and the confluence of different things that have caused this to happen. So can you just kind of illuminate that for us?
Yeah, so I'm just going to try and compress 50 hours of video.
Sorry
and
about
book,
that. Thousands of hours of study and This is tabloid now, John. You just gotta get it out.
I want to try and pick up on something Elizabeth said and about the individualism and loneliness, and I want to do see this notion of meaning. First of all, it's a metaphor, but there's something analogous about how we are connected to reality and other people. That's like how sentences, connect us to the world. That's the sort of core metaphor. But what has been forgotten, even in sort of my own discipline, the psychology of meaning in life, and I'm working on a paper criticizing that, we have lost a really important dimension, and Elizabeth, I think, is putting her finger on it. See, the notion of meaning is not just a descriptive term, like tall. It's what's called a thick term. It points to a phenomena that's thick. I'm not just describing. So let me use another one, just that's non-controversial. Rational. When I say you're rational, I'm not only describing you, I'm praising you. And I'm recommending that people pay attention to your behavior. When I say of somebody their life is meaningful, I'm not just describing it. I'm praising their life, and I'm recommending that other people consider it and correct themselves maybe in terms of it. So there's what, I'll use a philosophical term here, there's a normative dimension to meaning. Meaning is being held against some standard of how it can be better or worse. And what that immediately puts us into is the fact that meaning can't be a private, internal, subjective matter. And that is how we conceive of it in our culture. We conceive of meaning as sort of, I have my meaning. And that doesn't make any sense. So let's use the analogy, the meaning of a sentence. Lewis Carroll was famous for it. I forget which character it was, who just tries to use words to mean what, I can use words to mean whatever I want. Well, no, you can't. Meaning is inherently shareable. Like if it's not shareable, you don't have it. Wittgenstein made a famous argument about this. You can't have a private language because whatever term you use to describe your inner experience, how do you know if you're applying it correctly or not? If it's purely subjective, you can't be right. You can't be right or you can't be wrong. There's nothing there. That's the point. It has to be shareable. And we don't ask, is your life meaningful? And we list off my purposes and my trophies. Well, how much is your life shareable with others? How much is your meaning in life shareable with other people? We don't even think to ask that question. That would have been a fundamental question. So first there's that aspect. And that shareability, as I mentioned, has normativity in it. That means we have an obligation to correction. We have to mutually correct each other, like we correct each other in the meaning of a term. You can't use cat to mean an animal that loves you, something like that. It pretends to, but it doesn't really. Things like, that was a joke. Okay, right? We have to, and of course we argue about the meanings of terms precisely because we want to correct to a shared understanding that we have. Now, what that means is we want to share it, and we have to correct each other in it, which means there's an aspirational dimension to meaning. Like, if you're not striving with other people in mutual correction and mutual relationship to get more meaning in life, I would argue you don't actually have meaning in life. You have something else.
So why do you stop short then? Because under that set of definitions, you might say the most simple way to access normative values and also a community who will share these normative values with you would be to, of course, join a congregation, go to church. Why is it that you stop short of telling people, prescribing, like many of your colleagues in the more YouTube-y, dark webby kind of side of the equation would do, which would be to say you must convert and you must join a community of Christians? Why is it that you stop short of that?
Well, because put those two things together, like being bound into being role models for each other, aspiring to a deepening of meaning of life. We still have to talk primarily about what it is. I'm just bringing out this dimension. But the thing I want to say here is those dimensions automatically commit you to something that the ancients thought was inherently bound up with meaning in life, which is wisdom. If you were to say to the ancients, well, my life is meaningful, they'd say, oh, how are you cultivating wisdom? And you, what? And they would find it almost unintelligible. And I'm talking about cross-cultural, historical. They would find it unintelligible that you're talking about eudaimonia or meaning in life and you're not cultivating wisdom, because they got that this is normative. They got that this requires shareability and correction. They got that this requires that we have virtuous relationships with each other. They got this deeply. And here's a kind of biting remark I want to make because of my own personal upbringing, and I want to say that it is dripping with personal bias. The Protestantism I was brought up in did not in any way educate me or even role model how I should go about cultivating wisdom. And that makes me no different than my largely secular students, where I ask them, where do you go for information? They hold up their phones like this is, right? Where do you go for knowledge? And they're like, oh, science, maybe in history, and they're all worried because they've lost trust, another aspect of the meaning crisis. And then I say, where do you go to cultivate wisdom? Where do you go to overcome self-deception, foolishness? Where do you go in order to get more deeply connected to what is really true, what is really real? And they look at me with an anxious silence. Another way of talking about the meaning crisis is that it's a wisdom famine. Maybe that is the hunger that Elizabeth is talking about. Mm-hmm. And I have not found, let me correct that sentence. The religions I was exposed to as I was growing up did not do that for me. I had to leave Christianity, and I found that when I encountered the figure of Socrates, when I read Plato in my first year of university, and I went, that is my role model. That is the person I'm going to aspire to be like, because I want what he clearly has. I don't fully get it, but he's clearly wise, and I want that.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, you had that journey from a revelation to attempted atheism and back, but you, I'm sure, understand the criticisms of those who, like John, have come from a position where they have found in practice religion to be greatly lacking in wisdom. In fact, quite the opposite. Yeah. Potentially even diverting from wisdom.
Oh, yeah.
This must be something people bring to you all the time.
Yeah. The church is too often a bin fire. I think we shouldn't be surprised, right? I really keep stumbling over this word religion because we mean so many different things about it. And it's a kind of 16th, 17th century concept in the way that we mean it, and the category's too baggy, and does Christianity even fit in it? But insofar as, we're going to use it as a shorthand, I think it's very obvious that there's good and bad religion, right? Like in the book of James, in the New Testament, James is talking about bad religion, self-deceptive religion that allows us to puff ourselves up, to create a tribe, to excuse our behavior, to build our self-righteousness. And what he seems to be talking about, and what I find in my tradition talking about, is that the religion that is healthy and humanizing and wise orients us to the other, to God and to the other. And that's because humans are made in the image of God, right? That our ability to tend to and take seriously and almost humble ourselves before other human beings, and particularly in their most vulnerable, outcast, off-putting state, is how we can, one way we can think about healthy and unhealthy. You know, Pilate said, "Behold the man," to Jesus. A kind of Christian humanism says we see God in vulnerable humanity. And insofar as these rituals and these practices and these stories and these morally formative communities are allowing us to see each other as worthy of our love and our care, insofar as it allows us to humble. So Augustine said the difference between Platonism, well, in fact, Rowan Williams, talking about Augustine and his difference, what he sees the difference between Platonism and Christianity, and forgive me, you may completely disagree because I don't know Plato well enough. But Augustine, who was drawn to these kind of Neoplatonic versions in his time, said, "I was not humble enough to receive the humble Jesus as my God." And for me, the heart of religion, good religion, the heart of belief, the heart of devotion, which is actually the word that's used in James, is that humbling of ourselves, the decentering of the self, before God and before other human beings who need our care and require something of us and who we are covenanted with. And anything that pulls us apart from that, that allows us to turn in on ourselves and have contempt, hatred, dismissal, apathy towards other human beings, is bad religion.
Okay, so this is a good time to talk about cultural Christianity, because in this country at least, there's been this secondary resurgence, not just of church going, but also of this idea that one could be a cultural Christian, not perhaps a practicing Christian. I mean, even Richard Dawkins came out and called himself a cultural Christian. But that appears to be using Christianity as a bulwark against the other. Very much not the humble and open-armed version of Christianity that you've just laid out for us there. So where does that fit in? Because that does seem to be an element of pushing back against this kind of meaning crisis, to say one could take on cultural Christian values and use them to imbue life with more meaning, to get away from the secularism, coldness of the contemporary world. But is that actually more damaging? Because if you take the sense of Christianity that you've just given, or the sense of faithfulness that John was talking about, that very strong and harsh version of a kind of Christian distinction feels anathema to that.
Yeah.
So I wonder what you both think. I don't know if you've encountered this term, John.
Of course I have.
Yeah.
And I think anything that instrumentalizes the sacred for us is evil and idolatrous. So I'm deeply opposed to cultural Christianity. It bespeaks a mindset that is the antithesis of the proper orientation. And it misses something. And here I'm going to also defend Plato against Augustine. And actually point to something that I think is at the heart of Christianity. Plato's, one of his core arguments, his core themes that he comes to it so many different ways, and he's always circumambulating it and pointing at it, is human beings, when they're facing this issue of meaning, they have two great temptations, let's put, that can utterly destroy meaning in life and make them foolish and vicious. And this is because human beings are actually a binding together of being finite, very fallible, open, very, very prone to self-deception, very prone to foolishness. And we are also beings who are capable of amazing transcendence. And we can have mystical experiences. We can create astonishing works of art, fantastic works of philosophy. Now, if we identify, Plato's argument was, if we identify only with our transcendence, then we fall prey to inflation and we become tyrannical. And we lose the connectedness that is at the heart of what we're talking about here, this faithfulness and this deeper sense of meaning. But if we identify only with our finitude and our failure, then we will fall prey to despair and we will become servile and we will become the victim of tyrants. And so Plato presented Socrates as somebody who holds together and says you always have to constantly be mutually remembering these, that you are finite transcendence. And I put it to you that why there was this sort of magnetism between Platonism and Christianity. If you look at the crucifixion is the epitome of this holding together in tension, not in a logical resolution, because you can't resolve them. You can't say, here's the final solution, right? You have to constantly hold them and constantly negotiate them. The crucifixion is the holding together of finitude and transcendence. And it's holding it together in the face of the fact that human beings, they undergo tremendous loss and suffering. And I think this is why Christianity and Platonism, I think this is the deeper grammar of why they found each other. And the problem, to return to your point, with cultural Christianity is it's all about the triumph. It's all about the growth. It's all about the power. It's all about us winning. And it's all about the transcendence, and it loses what Elizabeth is talking about. It loses the capacity for wonder, because the capacity for wonder is ultimately born and rooted in humility, which is a recognition of our proclivity to failure, to self-deception, and to foolishness.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. I think something that's calling itself Christianity that doesn't take seriously its central figure is always going to be, I'm always going to be suspicious of. You know, Jesus' clearest commands are love your neighbor, and the neighbor that he's talking about there is the Samaritan, who is a radically different, ostracized racial group. Not just your neighbor, love your enemy. Love, like neighbor love and enemy love as central to the Christian ethic. And then when Jesus says in the parable of the sheep and the goats, every time you fed the hungry and visited the prisoner and clothed the naked, every time you showed care to the most desperate, vulnerable, precarious people in your midst, who the Hebrew Bible often talks about as the quartet of the vulnerable, the poor, the alien, the stranger, the widow, the orphan, that was an act of love towards me. So any Christianity that's not centering those two key ethics, do we call it that? I don't think I get to say. I'd phrase a question. But there is a form of cultural Christianity which I'm less hostile to. And it is, one, acknowledging how many of the things, let's just talk about Britain, in the history of our nation, we hold precious, have their roots in the Bible, actually, and that we can name and value that. And that is a good thing, to not cut off the branch that we're sitting on. Acknowledging the soil in which this particular tree has grown, I don't think that is an illegitimate thing to do. And I also think, because my understanding of what belief is very much about orientation and attention rather than intellectual assent. I have lots and lots of friends who say, I would love to believe. I would like this to be true, but I can't do the thing that I think we too often think, which is like, I don't believe in the virgin birth, therefore I cannot be a Christian. And I want to say, come and be. Like, come and practice. Come and be in a community and turn your attention with others towards these stories. And because of how attention works, you might find that kind of narrowing form of rationality that we can maybe talk about as left hemisphere, if it's helpful or if it's not. But this expansive, relational, interconnected forms of attention that you get in healthy spiritual practice then make the possibility of meeting, of belief, of encounter real for you. Mm-hmm. And so cultural Christianity, that is a form of orienting people towards something that they want to be formed by because it seems like there is goodness, truth and beauty there for them. Like, I love that Richard Dawkins is going to Evensong. I think that's good for him, right? Great. Let's get those stories into his veins. Like, and I don't want to pour scorn on that.
Okay. Though, to defend the cultural Christians, I suppose, for a moment, we live in a multi-faith society. We do not live in a kind of explicitly, solely Christian society in the US or either here in Britain. So how do we deal with that? The natural friction that will obviously occur between, it sounds lovely, the kind of opening out of Christian values to all, and the reality, which is that there are different sets of normative values held by different groups of people. You both seem like fairly tolerant people, but there is obviously a growing intolerance that you can see very clearly in this country and in the US to those ideas of differences of value. cultural Christianity, I would say, is downstream of that feeling, which is shared by many. Can there really be a kind of opening out of this idea of faith for all when we've already diversified to such an extent that there feels like a true lack of common ground for many people?
Well, first of all, a slight bit of pushback on what Elizabeth said. I agree that we should acknowledge what we owe Christianity, but if that makes us cultural Christians, it also makes us cultural Platonists. We owe as much to Greek philosophy as we do to Christianity for our civilization. And that's not radical to say to anybody in the ancient world. This was clearly the view of many of the church fathers, and it's clearly the view of some of my friends within Christianity, like Bishop Maximus. We're entering this really ahistorical period, which is dangerous, but that's just another symptom and another topic, perhaps. Let me tell you about some research. He was a student of mine, and then he was a TA and an RA, and now he's a co-author, and he's a professor in his own right. I'm very proud of him, Junsun Kim. He was doing work on wisdom cultivation. And what he did is he was looking at people who were recommended as role models and individuals who were aspiring and trying to become more wise. And we have several ways of measuring if people are becoming wiser. And what he finds reliably is that people who are within a religious tradition do better at the cultivation of wisdom than people who are secular. But he also finds there is no significant difference between the traditions in how well people cultivate wisdom. And this, along with a lot of other evidence and argument, and especially about how much more central I think ritual is, and last time I was here, we were talking about ritual. How much more central ritual is, and how we know in a non-propositional way through ritual, and how we know in a non-propositional way through transformation, and that fundamental alteration as we aspire to become more virtuous and more wise. I think that those things are much more important than our statements of beliefs. I'm not some sort of crypto-perennialist here, but I think when you drop below the propositions, you'll find a tremendous amount of convergence on those things that aren't bound to differences in terms of our propositional statements. So I've been privileged to watch discussions I don't even know if discussion is the right word. I'm searching encounters between monks from different religious traditions. And it's astonishing how neither one of them tries to convert the other. I'll just pretend there's two people here. They found deep resonance, and they're really open, vulnerable to learning. Not trivially, politely, liberal democracy, well done, very good for you, I respect it. Not that, like, oh, that could change how I'm a Christian. Oh, that could change how I'm a Buddhist. I'm talking about that kind. I've seen that, and I've witnessed that. Mm-hmm. And yet it doesn't result in anyone leaving their home or their religious home, but yet you get this deep thing.
Do you think that applies to religions or segments of religions that believe in the family you grew up in might be an example of this, punishment for non-belief? Can that apply to them?
I would hope that the evidence we have that all human beings are seeking for these two dimensions. I think Elizabeth, or maybe you, Flo, I can't remember, mentioned a vertical and a horizontal.
That sounds more like Elizabeth than it sounds like me.
So we vertically, we want inner peace. We want sort of our rationality and our sociality and our appetitive natures to not be at war with. It's a meta drive. Mm-hmm. So whatever satisfies us, we don't want it to cause inner turmoil and dissonance. We want a profound kind of inner peace, but I think Plato's term for it is better. We want an inner justice between all. And then we have the other meta drive. We want to be in contact with what's most real. We don't want what gives us our joy, our pleasure, or even our meaning to be illusory. So I'll do this with my students. I think I mentioned this to you already, Elizabeth. How many of you are in like a really rich and wonderful romantic relationship? Because romantic relationships are sort of our culture's alternative to God. Right? You will find the one and they will give you everything and you will be happy in life and the universe will smile upon you. And it's all bullshit, right? And no relationship can bear it. And so you ask people, what makes your lives? Well, my romantic relationships. What causes the most suffering in your life? Oh, my romantic relationships. Okay, so I'll put all of that aside. So I'll ask them, how many of you would want to know if your partner was cheating on you and that would mean the absolute collapse and end of the relationship? And almost all of them put their hands up. And I said, well, why? And here's all my students, and they're all cynical and bitten by nihilism and postmodernism, or what's real. And they say to me without dropping a beat, because it wouldn't be real. It wouldn't be real, right? And this is another Platonic thing. This is something I'm faithful to. I think those two drives are just so fundamental in human beings that there is an ultimate place within everybody that we can appeal to. We can appeal to, do you want inner peace? And do you want an inner peace that is giving you more contact with reality? And do you want a contact with reality that is giving you more inner peace? And I think, does that mean everybody's reachable? That's ridiculous. Tell me any pedagogical strategy that reaches everybody. That doesn't exist. But do I carry a kind of hope that there is that ultimate thing that I can appeal to in everybody? Yes, I carry that.
If we think of this through the lens of attention and devotion and this energetic field, what is the iPhone in this world?
An idol. I think distraction has always been a sole danger, right, in every society. Monks in the desert write about distraction. It is not a new phenomenon, it's not a new temptation for us. But like many of our unhelpful tendencies, it's being weaponized against us. And the atrophying of our spiritual health because of that, I think, is really serious. And I say that as a full-blown hypocrite in this area who's desperately trying to claw back my attention and orient it towards something that might form me towards being the kind of person I think the world needs, the kind of person I want to be becoming, not this scattered, fractured, anxious, tribal, cravey consumer, which is useful for the economy.
Tell me about it. When your students say, when you ask them, where do you get your wisdom from? And they say, from my phone.
Or information.
Information from. What does that mean to you? What does that tell you about their state of mind and what kind of people they might become?
Well, there's something really important about human beings that's really deep, because it goes back several species in our evolutionary history. Andy Clark, a very famous cognitive scientist, wrote a book called Natural Born Cyborgs. We are cyborgs. We integrate ourselves with machinery. So other than our naked bodies and the atmosphere, everything else, our clothing, everything is our tools. It's all tools. And your brain actually wraps your body image around the tools you're using. If you're using a sword, your brain will extend. You're driving your car. You ever had that? Your sense of where your body is extends out through your car. One of the biggest mistakes we make with technologies, we think we're just using it. Okay, that's not. We have not evolved to use tools. The tools shape us as much as we shape them. And so when you're using something like an iPhone, idle's a good term, but there's two things happening there. Your identity is being bled out beyond you because all of your metadata, all of your preferences are going out there, and then they're being nudged, often without our awareness, in direction. So you're losing your agency. And at the same time, the phone is isolating you. And social media is isolating us. We're getting trapped inside this little bubble of our own subjective way, our own subjectivity. And so you'll see the weird phenomenon of everybody walking down the street looking at their phones. Just pause and think about that, how we've just lost the moments of eye contact with strangers. We're turning into zombies. We're turning into zombies in a really profound way. And so the problem is that we're losing, right? We're bleeding our agency and we're getting isolated, so we're losing that fundamental connectedness to ourselves and other people that is so essential. But the thing is, if you take somebody's phone away, and I'm like Elizabeth, you can't operate in the business world without a phone, or the social world, but people experience the closest thing we have to it is when I take your phone away, you experience a kind of anxiety that a parent experiences when their child is missing. It's not quite as intense, but it's on that level. And so you have this tremendous, right? And that's what I mean about how so 2 points I'm trying to make. You don't just use tools, you identify with them. That's why you wear the clothes you wear, right? You identify with them. And that identity is being bled away from you. And it's also what's left of your identity is being isolated and atomized and cut off.
I mean, you might even go a step further, the iPhone being the idol, and say that it's even more like a pseudo-religion in that it gives you a sense that you are connecting more. It is telling you that you are able to connect to something higher than yourself.
And this is going to get worse. This is going to get worse as AGI rolls in. And so I've been sort of predicting for artificial general intelligence, ChatGPT and all that stuff, DeepSeek. When that first was coming, I said, be very careful. People already take a slightly religious attitude towards their phones. When AGI comes on, people are going to start taking up religious relationships with their devices. And then but it's not going to be clean, it's going to bleed. What is Christianity, for example? And I'm not making Elizabeth the sole repository of Christianity.
Why not?
But what is Christianity going to do with somebody who's talking to some avatar of Jesus that they've got the LLM to give, and they believe that Jesus is actually better than the Jesus of the Bible? What's going to happen now? How are we going to deal with that? We're not even thinking about these questions. So the question about the relationship between meaning, these increasingly advancing technologies that tear into our identity, and our religiosity, all of them are being put through an enormous experiment, not to our benefit, and chances are we're going to lose out in it in the long run.
One of the concepts that I think is really helpful is formation, and Jesuits talk about that really explicitly. But I think it's basically what this bizarre category of religion is best at. What morally formative communities of collective, and the collective is so important. Like you could make a distinction, not a brilliant one, but one distinction between the spiritual and the religious is you can be spiritual on your own, you cannot be religious on your own. That collective forms of spiritual ritual and practice have an intention to be forming you into something, right? So in my tradition, we want to be formed to be more like Jesus. I wouldn't speak for the others, but I imagine there's equivalents in other religions. Our information age is forming us is one, without our full consent, and two, towards whatever is useful for the market in the moment. And so for me, my sense of the power of spiritual practice and my religious practice is that it gives me back a little bit of agency about who do I want to be becoming. Like I really care about who I am when I die and what people say about me at my funeral. And it feels like the spiritual technologies, you might want to call them, the collective spiritual practices of formation and attention, in my case towards wanting to be more like Jesus, are active resistance against the person that I'm becoming when my phone is like this.
I think that's right. There's academic work that's now been taken up. There's been a significant book published and a significant anthology, I believe through Cambridge, on religion and AGI, religion and artificial intelligence. This is very much, I have said, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that I think the science of the future is theology. But of course, theology is going to be very different than it has been since the Enlightenment.
Listening to you all, it's clear that you're all very smart and very knowledgeable. And Elizabeth, when I heard you talking about the way that you turn towards relationality and the resurrection, I had a very visceral, I felt like I was going to weep. And it was nothing to do with the words and the rational cleverness that there is in this room in abundance. And so I really believe in that power of that non-wordy, very powerful, feeling transmission. I don't know what the words for it are, but I know that it's quite rare in our culture. And so I'm just really interested to hear from you all. How do we make more spaces for that?
I take very seriously what you said. I'm not attributing this to you, but I want to make a distinction. But the problem with the word feeling is it's one of these mushy words. And I know you struggled around the word, and I got a sense that you didn't find it adequate to what you were addressing. Because, of course, we've had this notion of feelings in Schleiermacher and the Romantics, and how do you feel about things? And we do a lot of that in the culture, and that's what I sense you're not talking about that. What you're talking about is we have non-propositional ways of connecting. We have outside of words that are connecting. But we have been so blinded by the scientific revolution and the Reformation to concentrate on our words and if we believe them or not, that we think that's the primary way we connect to reality. And what cognitive science has been arguing now for about 30 years, and I'm one of the people in this camp, is that's not the case. Your propositional knowing is not the deepest way in which, and the most primary ways in which you are connected to reality. So propositional knowing is knowing that something is the case. Like cats are mammals, and Augustine was a Platonist and a Christian, and all that sort of stuff. But that's not the same thing as knowing how.
Knowing who.
You have to know how to kiss somebody. You have to know how to swim. You have to know how to catch a ball. And your skills aren't true or false. They fit or they don't. And if I were to ask you, without showing me how to swim, it's very hard for you to put it into words. Very, very hard. But then I noticed you're not swimming right now. Well, why not? Because you have consciousness, you have situational awareness, you know what it is to be here now and to be you, and you realize and you notice that swimming isn't appropriate or necessary. You have perspectival knowing. You know what it's like to be here and now, to be present, to be really present. And when I ask you to try and articulate what consciousness is and presence is, you go, I really know it, but try to put it into words. It's really, really hard. And then you have this deeper thing, the way, a lot of forces that you're not aware of, and I'm not aware of, that have shaped me and have shaped the environment so we fit together, so you participate in the world in an ongoing and reliable way. So you get a sense of belonging here that's almost unconscious, but it's there like a foundation. That's also ineffable. And all of these non-propositional ways of knowing are fundamental to your agency. And they reach deep down into your embodiment, and they're ineffable. And they reach up into the heights of your spiritual relationship to what is ultimate, and it's also ineffable. And because we are so fixated on propositions and words and ideologies, we have lost touch with this axis. But here's what I want to propose to you, that wordy intelligence is going to be replaced by the machines, because that's what they have. We are more and more, we think that what matters is technical manipulation of propositions. The machines are overtaking us in that. If we want to retain our humanity, we have to orient to this axis from our deepest embodiment to our highest spiritual aspiration that is largely ineffable and is bound up with all this non-propositional knowing. Because if we don't, we will not have a place where we can situate our humanity.
Elizabeth, anything to add?
Not a lot, no. Hartmut Rosa talks about resonance, which I find helpful.
Oh, I love Hartmut Rosa.
That, but we're always gesturing, right? Always gesturing towards something that is beyond words. It's why I'm more and more just prepared to show up in public and read a poem, because the dominance for such a long time.
Oh, I hope you don't do that. I find your speech so lyrical to begin with.
Thank you. What a lovely thing to say. There's the kind of straightforward answer to that, which is like, actually value the arts. Actually acknowledge that all of us, most of us, feel most fully human in a dark theatre, feeling grief with 200 other people, right? Or when a song says something and drops into the kind of unavoidable interiority of our consciousness and connects us with everyone else with this twang, this thread that pulls taut, and we see our interdependence. I think just being less embarrassed, being less prepared to be cowed, by the form of intelligence that we need, right? I don't want to denigrate the kind of intelligence that John's talking about. It's made huge strides. Like, it's the reason I didn't die in childbirth. I am grateful for it. And our full humanity requires us to acknowledge the things that cannot be said. And we've forgotten how to do that.
My daughter didn't have a phone until she was 18. She's now 20. And I don't have a smartphone.
Woohoo!
I had one for years, but I got rid of it because I didn't really use it. But I'm going to say something in favor of them in some way, because what I've seen with my daughter is, I suspect we're a bit boomerish about this, that what I see with my daughter is a level of communication going on with her friends, not just here, but elsewhere, that is completely different from anything I did and I see with other people my age. I mean, she's traveling to Korea this week, and she's going to work in Korea and in Japan for 4 months. All of it was organized through networks of friends and friends to be that she's going to meet when she goes there in the most extraordinary way. And I don't want to diss that. I think that's great. So, and she's quite disciplined about it. She doesn't scroll endlessly and walk down the street staring at it. So I think I think we need to balance that critique a little bit. But the thing I really wanted to ask you about was practice. I'm curious, because I sort of know what your practice is, but I'm curious what your practice is, not what you actually do. Like I'm involved in meditation, Tai Chi. What's your actual practice in terms of beyond words and stuff?
Yeah, I want to be clear that I take your critique. It's totally legit. I use a phone. You can't get away with it. It affords and empowers us in certain ways. I do want to note that although we are more socially connected than we ever have, the number of close friends we have is reliably going down by decades. So social connectivity is not translating into friendship. It's not translating into intimate relationship. It's not translating into transformative conversations. So I do want to acknowledge its social power. I hope I didn't come across as prohibiting phones, or I don't want to censor anybody's use of it. I use it too. About practice, I agree with you. In fact, I often say, don't tell me what you believe, tell me what you practice. I don't really care a lot about what people believe, because contrary to what we believe in our culture, our beliefs don't drive our behavior as much as other things like our skills, our states of consciousness, our states of affect, etc. So what do I practice? I practice every day. I do 3 forms of Tai Chi Chuan. I do I Chuan and Jan Zheng with that. I then do pranayama practices, and then I do an integration of something like Vipassana meditation and contemplative practices drawn either from the Buddhist tradition or the Neoplatonic tradition. I often complement that with Lectio Divina, which is a way of reading a text in a sacred fashion. And then I also do certain imaginal practices, inner dialogue practices to bring on the Socratic tradition. And then when I can, I engage in practices, and some of them are practices I've been fortunate enough to be involved in helping to create and vet and test, dialogical practices with other people that are designed to transform conversation back into the kind of thing you see happening around Socrates, where the conversation is not one of just giving information or exchanging. You've all had these conversations, right, where the conversation takes on a life of its own, and everybody gets to a place they didn't expect to get to. And they know you, and you know you couldn't have got there on your own. Well, that's what I call dialogos. And so we have practices like dialectic in the dialogos. We have the Socratic search breaks practice, where there's a community around that in which people get together, and there's a way of doing Socratic questioning in which you learn how to convert a personal problem that you hold to yourself, and you try and get it into a shareable existential dilemma, and then you work together to try and get clear on what virtue would bear on that dilemma most appropriately, and then that person can take that resolution of a response to the existential dilemma back into their personal problem and therefore into their lives. So that's sort of what I practice.
Oh, it's amazing we managed to get you in the building, isn't it? It's incredible we've managed to find a small window in John's schedule to get him here. But we do appreciate the wisdom and enlightenment it brings. Let's take another question. Yeah.
My question is mostly for John, and it's about formation. And actually, it sort of ties into that big list of practices. I can't really imagine how I'd pass that on to my kids if I shared that list of practices.
Yeah.
It's so individual. It's so idiosyncratic. And in a way, both of your stories are very individual and idiosyncratic. Elizabeth, you had that very personal experience of how you came really to your faith. I'm Catholic. I was raised Catholic. I wasn't Catholic for a few years, and then I became Catholic again and realized I'd been Catholic the whole time. Because in a sense, no matter what I do, and even if I propositionally at some point stop believing what the Catholic Church teaches, in some real sense, I'll still be a Catholic down to my core because it's what I was raised in. And I'm wondering, John, do I still do that going forward? Do I try to raise my kids Catholic? Do I try to hold to that? Because I don't know how I could pass it all on propositionally or philosophically outside of those practices.
There's two ways you can be asking that question. You can be asking that question sort of like as a challenge or a theoretical, or you could be asking that question as if you're wanting advice from me. Which is it?
It's more the first. Well, if you have anything on the second, I'll take it.
I don't want to take the role of the second. One of the things I consistently practice and not just say is, and this is because a lot of people say this to me, is if the work I do helps people to return to a religious home, and that's the right way of thinking about it, a religious home, great. I want to ameliorate the suffering, the hunger of the meaning crisis. I'm not trying to win a particular social cause, right? And so, okay, what the research shows is that people are not, I know this is going to fly in the face of what people want to hear. So this is scientific work done by atheists. Just to be clear, okay? The thing that makes you a theist or an atheist is not how analytic your thinking is or how emotional or intuitive your thinking is, contrary to what we believe. In fact, there are weird correlations. Your country is one of the weird correlations. It's usually the United States that's the weird correlation. But the UK is the weird correlation in that religiosity and analytic thought are actually positively correlated with each other, which is contrary to the typical atheist story that people are religious because they're not capable of good analytic reflective thought. That's not what drives what religion people take up, or if they become atheists or not, contrary to what we like to tell ourselves in our own ego-stroking autobiographies. What is the most overwhelming predictor, and it's not poverty or other things we've been told since the Enlightenment, the overwhelming predictor is, what are the people in your life that you regard as credible? And this has a specific meaning, which means they do what are called credibility-enhancing displays, which is the following. They do something that you don't understand, but because you trust them and you've seen their wisdom, you are willing to imitate them to see if they can open your eyes to something. And before you think that's stupid, that's how kids work. Because that's our biggest advantage over chimps, is we trust our adults way more. And that's how come we're capable of culture. So what predicts what your kids will be is the degree to which you do credibility-enhancing displays that they don't initially understand, but they are willing to imitate because they trust and love you, that will actually form them. That is my scientific answer to you.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted to tie together some of these questions, because it feels there does seem to be a kind of overarching theme or resonance or something that happens in a room like this. And I think maybe it might be something to do with sincerity. Both of you are extremely sincere people, and I mean that with no
It sounds a little bit aggressive.
no positive or negative connotation. I myself am not. And I think that one of the most refreshing things about a room like this is that I think what I get from people here is a real yearning for sincerity. There is a lot of cynicism, a lot of irony in the world at the moment, and there does seem to be a strong desire for sincere things. Now, I'm not going to say that the entire Christian revival has come off the back of a yearning for sincerity, but what do you think to that hypothesis that perhaps that might be quite a significant part of the story?
I would frame it as a yearning for depth rather than, sincerity is a good thing. Honesty is the word I prefer. authentic has been really hollowed out. Trying as far as it is possible within your foolish and fragile human consciousness to tell the truth about what you think. And for me, the truth is often, I don't know. And being prepared to say that opens up space to be humans together, that I think is very powerful. But yes, I think insofar as we are seeing an uptick in interest, spiritual openness, it is that William James called it the more, right? Nick, who's here tonight, talks about the more, the sense of something beyond what we have been sold in a materialist worldview that basically says acquire status and possessions, comfort and convenience, and that is the fullness of the good life. Anyone with half a brain cell knows that is not true. All the great art says that is not true. There is something more. And for better or worse, religions have tended to be the places that give you permission to sincerely seek it.
Elizabeth Oldfield and John Vervaeke, thank you very much.